Okay guys, let's start with what every wire service is reporting today, because you should have the plain version before anything else. Overnight into Thursday, Russia hit Kyiv with one of the heaviest bombardments of the entire war, 74 missiles and 496 drones, according to Ukraine's own Air Force. The death toll has climbed through the day from an initial 8 up through 1821. And by Thursday afternoon, Kyiv city administration was reporting 27 dead and more than 100 injured, with search teams still working through a collapsed 9-story building in the Darnitsky district. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko called it simply massive. The Kremlin's own defense ministry said the strike targeted military industrial facilities and fuel depots in Kyiv, plus airfield infrastructure in 4 other regions, and Russian spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters flatly that Russia will continue to increase the pace of its attacks. Meanwhile, barely 12 hours later, Ukraine's own security service hit back, striking 2 Russian air bases in occupied Crimea, Saki and Hwadiske, destroying or damaging at least 7 aircraft, the second hit on Saki in a single week. That's the story everywhere today. Missile barrage, rising body count, tit-for-tat retaliation. But here's the thing, almost nobody in that coverage is asking directly, and it's the question that actually matters. Why now? Ukraine has been sending long-range drones deep into Russian territory for months. That's not new. Russian officials are framing last night as retaliation, plain and simple, for Ukraine's own strikes on Russian oil infrastructure. It's a clean story, and it fits a narrative a lot of us already believe by default, that Russia reacts, that Russia gets provoked into action, rather than acting on its own logic and its own timetable. It lets Moscow tell its own population, watching gas lines form at home, that this is response, not simply what Russian strategy has been doing all along at a larger scale. I want to spend the next half hour actually testing that story against the numbers, the documents, and the pattern. Because once you strip the framing away from both sides, what's underneath is a lot more dangerous than Russia retaliated. Let that sink in, and let's go find the receipts. Start with the target list, because it tells you something the revenge strike framing conveniently skips over. According to the mapping done by open source trackers in the hours after the attack, Russian strikes hit named industrial sites across Kyiv, a metrology and instruments plant, an aviation components manufacturer, several logistics terminals, and a fuel storage facility, alongside military airfield infrastructure in the Dnipropetrovsk, Poltava, Cherkasy, and Chernihiv regions. Not notably a saturation campaign against apartment blocks and shopping centers, which is what you'd expect from a strike explicitly designed to punish and terrorize a civilian population to submission. Roughly 20 to 27 people died. And I want to be careful here. That is a real tragedy for every single one of those families, and nothing in this analysis minimizes that. But 27 deaths from a strike using close to 600 missiles and drones is not, mathematically, what a deliberate campaign to kill as many civilians as possible looks like. If maximizing civilian death were the actual objective of an attack at that scale, the number would be an order of magnitude higher. What you're actually looking at is something Russia has done repeatedly for 4 years running, a large strike against strategic industrial and military adjacent targets with civilian casualties as an accepted byproduct of hitting targets embedded inside a dense capital city, not the stated goal. Nothing structurally new happened last night except scale. This was, by most independent counts, among the 2 or 3 largest single bombardments of the war. The Kremlin will frame it publicly as retaliation, because that plays well domestically. It lets Russian citizens standing in a fuel line hear that this is reactive, defensive, forced upon Moscow by Kyiv's own escalation, rather than simply the next increment in a strategy that's been running the same basic playbook since 2022. Strip the framing away though, and what's left is continuity, not a turning point. Which brings us to the real question sitting underneath everything else today. How deep does outside involvement in this war actually go? Because Moscow has never described this as a purely bilateral fight with Kyiv, and this week handed Russian officials a piece of evidence that fits their narrative perfectly. 2 things happened this week that deserve to be read together, because separately they're a curiosity and a diplomatic footnote. Together, they tell you something real about where Western involvement in this war actually stands right now. First, the phone call. 2 well-known Russian pranksters, going by Vaughn and Lexis, called Estonia's National Security Advisor Madis Roll back in May, posing as Ukraine's National Security Council Secretary. Roll, believing he was speaking to a Ukrainian official, offered to help coordinate what he understood to be attacks on St. Petersburg, telling his caller in comments later published that if there were any coordination problems, he'd try to help, and that he was confident Estonia and Ukraine's defense ministries were already in contact on the matter. The Estonian president's office has since confirmed the call happened, insists no classified information was shared, and says Russian state media twisted the substance for propaganda purposes. That's almost certainly at least partly true. Pranksters release only the excerpts that make the target look worst. And Roll's own account says he was talking generally about preventing drones from reaching Estonian soil, not literally directing strikes. A second Baltic official, Lithuania's presidential security advisor, was caught in a nearly identical call and gave an even less guarded answer, according to the prankster's own release, though he later suggested the call may have been an AI-assisted intelligence operation rather than a simple prank. Here's why the framing fight over that call almost doesn't matter. You don't actually need a prank call to establish that Western involvement in Ukraine's strike campaign is real and expanding. You just need to read the G7's own communiqué from mid-June after leaders met in Evian, France. The language is direct. Leaders agreed, in their own words, to increase the delivery of air defense capacities, additional systems and interceptors, and long-range capabilities, and separately said they were ready to consider extending Ukraine licenses to expand its own domestic weapons production. Accelerate, increase, expand. Not maintain, not review. Accelerate. On a document with the signatures of every G7 head of state on it, published openly rather than whispered through a back channel. If anyone in the Kremlin still had genuine doubts about Western intentions heading into this summer, that single paragraph should have settled it. And it isn't just rhetoric sitting on paper. Reporting out of the G7 summit suggested the American president left more convinced than before that Ukraine's deep strike campaign into Russia was working and should go further, not less. A notable shift given how much of this year's diplomacy had been framed around slowing things down rather than accelerating them. Layer on top of that a detail that got surprisingly little coverage relative to its significance: NATO's own Allied Command transformation, together with a joint NATO-Ukraine training center, launched what it's calling the Persistent Airfield Denial Innovation Challenge in late June, a public openly advertised competition offering up to 250,000 euros to anyone, private company, or individual who can design a system to keep a Russian airfield unusable for an extended stretch of time. Read NATO's own language describing the problem: Russian tactical aviation, operating from bases beyond the reach of conventional Ukrainian strike systems, continues to conduct strikes using guided bombs and cruise missiles against, in NATO's own phrasing, friendly forces, critical infrastructure, and civilian population centers. That's NATO's own public messaging, using the word friendly forces to describe the Ukrainian side of this war. Whatever caution existed earlier in this conflict about how openly to describe Western involvement, it's visibly eroding by the month. This matters enormously for where this war goes next, because there's a threshold sitting in front of all of it that almost nobody in Western capitals seems eager to name out loud. What happens the day Russia decides the cost of restraint no longer makes sense? Ukrainian drones have already crossed into Baltic airspace on multiple occasions this year, and so far Russia hasn't responded to those incursions directly. But Russian officials have said plainly, on the record, that any drone launched from Baltic soil against Russian territory will draw a strike on the launch site itself, wherever that site sits. That is arguably the single most plausible pathway to a direct Russia-NATO confrontation right now, not some grand ideological collision between blocs, but a Baltic state's territory getting used, even informally, as a launch point, and Russia following through on a warning it has already issued in public. It's precisely because that scenario is so dangerous that no Baltic government has formally allowed it so far, whatever informal cooperation the Estonian and Lithuanian prank calls may have hinted at. Set that scenario aside for a second and ask the harder question underneath it. Is Russia actually building toward direct retaliation against Europe itself for its role in enabling Ukraine's strike campaign? There's a well-established argument circulating in Russian strategic military commentary circles that goes something like this: stop tolerating a drone war being waged with direct Western material and technical assistance, and start hitting the source of that assistance, rather than only the Ukrainian proxy carrying it out. Hit conventional military-industrial targets inside Europe first, the argument goes, and escalate further if that doesn't change Western behavior. That's a serious position held by serious people inside Russia's strategic community, and it deserves to be treated as a real possibility rather than dismissed as bluster. Why hasn't it happened yet? Probably two reasons. First, Russian air defense has by most accounts managed the drone threat to its own territory reasonably well up to this point. Not perfectly, given the fuel sector strikes we've already discussed, but well enough that the incentive to open an entirely new theater against NATO territory hasn't yet reached a breaking point. Second, and this is the part Western audiences rarely hear in full, the battlefield picture on the ground doesn't remotely resemble the Russia stalled and bleeding out narrative that dominates a lot of Western coverage. The CSIS study we'll get to in more detail shortly does show Russia posting a genuine net territorial loss in April and May, the first monthly setback since August of 2024. But by June, Deep State's own open source tracking shows Russian forces clawing back a net gain of roughly 11 square miles for the month. Progress has been slow and grinding, not a blitz. Nobody serious disputes that. But Russia is still closing the remaining ground in Donbass, and there isn't a great deal of that region left to take. As long as the front keeps moving in Russia's favor, even slowly, and the drone threat to Russian territory stays broadly manageable, the incentive to open a second, far more dangerous front against NATO territory stays comparatively low. That could change, but that's the actual calculus running in Moscow right now, not the one being narrated on cable news. I want to give this dynamic a name because I think once you see the shape of it, you'll recognize it everywhere in this conflict. Call it the restraint ledger. Here's the mechanism, step by step. Step 1. Restraint on one side of a conflict holds specifically because the cost being imposed on that side stays within a range its leadership judges tolerable, painful, but survivable, and survivable without requiring a direct confrontation with the larger alliance standing behind the other side. Call these cost pinpricks, individually absorbable, cumulatively expensive. Step 2. The entire logic of that restraint depends on the calibration holding steady, on the other side continuing to manage a stalemate rather than deliberately maximizing pain. Step 3. The moment the other side's strategy shifts, explicitly or gradually, toward maximizing pressure rather than managing the status quo, more air defense, more long-range strike capability, an openly advertised airfield denial competition, a G7 communique that says accelerate instead of maintain, the coping mechanism that has kept this a proxy war rather than a direct one, begins to strain. Step 4. At some point, the underlying question answers itself. If absorbing damage indefinitely stops being sustainable, and outright capitulation is politically and strategically impossible, what option remains besides striking the actual source of the pressure rather than only its Ukrainian instrument? Nobody wants to say this plainly in Western capitals, but pushing a restrained actor into a corner where restraint no longer serves its own interests is not a cost-free strategy. It risks producing exactly the confrontation everyone publicly claims to be trying to avoid. So why are Western governments being so open about all of this right now, rather than keeping it quiet the way covert support used to be handled even 2 years ago? There are a few honest possibilities. Maybe it's about normalizing the idea publicly so that if Russian retaliation against Europe eventually does come, it doesn't land as a total shock to Western publics. Maybe it's meant to reassure European and American audiences that Russia is too weak or too cautious to respond meaningfully, which conveniently supports the argument for staying the current course. Or maybe, and this is the explanation I find most persuasive, it's less a matter of deliberate signaling and more a matter of sincere belief. A meaningful share of the Western foreign policy and establishment appears to have genuinely convinced itself that a larger confrontation with Russia is coming, regardless of what anyone does now, not a possibility to be carefully managed, but an inevitability to be prepared for. Under that framing, Ukraine isn't just a country being defended for its own sake. It becomes the mechanism through which the West buys time to rearm before the real confrontation arrives. That belief doesn't have to be cynical or manufactured to be dangerous. Sincerely held beliefs are far harder to dislodge than calculated propaganda, precisely because the people repeating them usually believe every word. Let's steelman the opposing view properly, because there's a genuinely strong version of the Russia is running out of road argument, and it deserves full airtime before I push back on it. The strongest version goes like this. Ukrainian long-range strikes have knocked out roughly a quarter of Russia's oil refining capacity. Moscow has responded with visible fuel rationing, capped sales per vehicle, a ban on jerrycan refueling, suspended fuel exports, and that rationing has now visibly spread from the frontline regions and occupied Crimea into Moscow itself. Vladimir Putin, who rarely concedes a domestic problem publicly, has personally acknowledged the shortage, describing it as a real difficulty, even while insisting it's under control. Zelensky has authorized a specific 40-day campaign targeting exactly this refining infrastructure, and it's already producing results, a second strike on the Saki airfield this week, strikes reported on the Belgorod energy equipment plant, and Ukraine's own unmanned systems forces claiming a 1,150% increase in successful strikes on Russian targets since the start of the year, with 172 energy and defense industrial facilities hit in June alone. That's a real sustained resource campaign producing measurable industrial damage, not a hopeful talking point. That's the strongest, honest version of the case, and it's a serious one. Here's the limit on it. Fuel lines and rationing are genuinely uncomfortable for any government, but discomfort on its own has never been reliable proof of imminent political collapse. Plenty of countries manage supply shocks without their governments cracking. And there's a documented pattern worth remembering. Predictions of imminent Russian societal collapse have circulated in Western commentary on a roughly semi-annual cycle since 2022, each one recycled with fresh packaging once the last round quietly failed to materialize. That history doesn't make this round automatically wrong. The refinery numbers and Putin's own admission are real. But it's reason enough to hold the Russia is folding narrative more loosely than a lot of the current coverage is holding it. Now here's where the story gets genuinely hard to reconcile with itself, and it comes down to casualty math. A widely cited CSIS study published this week put combined Russian and Ukrainian casualties, killed, wounded, and missing above 2 million people for the first time. Broken down, the study estimates Russian casualties at roughly 1.4 million, including about 450,000 killed, against Ukrainian casualties of 525 to 625,000, including 125 to 150,000 deaths. Even taking the high end of the Ukrainian estimate, that works out to roughly a 3-to-1 ratio favoring Ukraine. Sit with that number for a second, because it does not survive contact with basic facts about how this war has actually been fought. Artillery has been the single largest killer on this battlefield for 4 years, and Russia has maintained something like a 5-to-1, possibly 10-to-1 advantage in sheer artillery volume for most of that stretch. Add in precision-guided glide bombs, which Russia has dropped by the thousands, and which Ukraine has essentially none of. Someone might respond that Russia has spent most of the war on the offensive, and offense typically produces more casualties than defense. True as a general rule, but that argument collapses the moment you remember how much of this war Ukraine itself has spent attacking the 2023 counteroffensive, the incursion into Kursk, the successful pushes in Kherson and Kharkiv back in 2022. Ukraine has been on the offensive for large stretches of this war too, which means the casualty asymmetry argument actually cuts against the reported 3-to-1 ratio, not in favor of it. A more defensible estimate, given the documented firepower disparity, would likely put Ukrainian losses considerably higher than what's currently being reported. This is not a minor statistical quibble, and the comparison worth making isn't a rhetorical flourish, it's a structural parallel to how body counts were handled during the Vietnam War. When an American command, under enormous domestic pressure to demonstrate progress, produced casualty figures that people inside that same system understood, at some level didn't match reality on the ground. The Vietnam-era dishonesty was largely conscious. What may be happening today looks different in one important respect. Today's version increasingly seems to be sincerely believed by the people repeating it, rather than manufactured with open eyes. That arguably makes it more dangerous, not less. A knowing lie can eventually be corrected once someone decides to stop lying. A sincerely held, mistaken narrative just keeps reproducing itself indefinitely. Here's a player who isn't part of the headline conflict at all, but who has enormous exposure to how it eventually resolves. Poland, and specifically its increasingly public discomfort with the pace of Western commitment to Ukraine. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said explicitly this week, ahead of the upcoming NATO summit, that Poland should be cautious about promising further Ukraine aid, not in his own words, because Ukraine doesn't need the financial assistance, but because Poland carries what he called very significant responsibilities tied to the entire eastern EU border. That's a genuinely notable statement from the leader of one of Ukraine's most consistently supportive neighbors, and it's a useful reminder that the West isn't the single unified bloc it so often gets described as. Layer on top of that a separate report from Corriere della Sera suggesting Ukraine may be allocated closer to $10 to $12 billion at the upcoming NATO summit, rather than the $40 billion previously floated in earlier discussions, a substantial gap between what was being discussed and what may actually materialize. And Poland's own military has been scrambling jets and restricting airspace in response to Russian strikes near its border with growing regularity, which tells you the country bearing the most direct frontline exposure to any miscalculation is also the one most visibly hedging its rhetoric right now. None of that means Poland is stepping back from Ukraine. It means the country with the most to physically lose from an escalation is being noticeably more careful with its language than some of the governments further from the border currently are. Oh, here's what I'd genuinely be tracking over the coming weeks, stated plainly enough that you can hold me to it. First, watch the NATO summit in Turkey next week, where both Trump and Zelensky are expected to attend. If the final aid package lands closer to the reported $10 to $12 billion figure rather than the $40 billion previously discussed, that tells you Western commitment is real, but more constrained than the rhetoric suggests. Another entry in the gap between promise and delivery. We've talked about today. If it lands at or above the higher figure instead, that's a genuine signal of accelerating, not just rhetorical, commitment. Second, watch whether Russia responds to the Estonian and Lithuanian prank call revelations with anything beyond diplomatic statements. If Moscow uses those calls as public justification for a strike on Baltic territory or infrastructure, that's the Baltic launch threshold we discussed becoming live, rather than theoretical. If it stays confined to angry press statements from Russia's foreign ministry, that tells you the threshold hasn't moved yet. Third, watch where Russian fuel rationing spreads next. If it deepens meaningfully inside Moscow itself over the coming weeks, rather than staying concentrated in Crimea and frontline regions, that's the fraying insulation Putin himself all but admitted to this week, moving from the periphery toward the political core. If instead rationing plateaus as refinery repairs catch up, the Russia is cracking narrative will have once again outrun the underlying data the way it has roughly every 6 months since 2022. None of what we've walked through today is destiny. Wars that look inevitable in hindsight were almost never inevitable in the room where the actual decisions got made. They're usually the accumulated result of a lot of individually reasonable people, each one convinced they were personally managing risk, right up until the moment it turned out none of them were. Go read the CSIS report yourself rather than taking my summary of it. Go read the actual G7 communique language rather than the headline paraphrase. Push back on me directly if you think the restraint ledger framework oversimplifies something, because geopolitics is almost always messier than any single framework wants it to be. But here's the question I'd leave you with. Every actor in today's briefing, Moscow, Kyiv, Washington, Brussels, the Baltic capitals, is currently betting that the other side's restraint will hold just a little longer while its own pressure keeps increasing. So the real question isn't who's telling the truth about today's strike. It's what happens the first time one side decides the other's restraint has finally run out.